Chapter 4. Welcome to Thermadore. Sat close together on the patio outside, the whole Grimes family gazed at the abundance of twinkling stars on the final summer night. After nearly 2 weeks of absence, Betty was glad to see her whole family together. She stared meekly at the sparkling night in reflection, and occasionally at them. She already missed them. Though she'd be gone a couple months, it would feel like a millennium based on her experience in Zaha's academy. But she'd be much farther away. Paddy wouldn't be there to answer all her questions, and Father Grimes wouldn't be there to hold her when she was distressed. Letters could never replace the gentle touch of their bodies. "Well, girls, we'd be off to bed then," Father Grimes declared. "Could we stay a bit longer?" Thorny asked. "Maybe another time. We wouldn't want you sleeping in on your first days of school." Flopping on her bed, all Betty could do was reflect. Reflect on not only the last 2 weeks, but the last 2 years. She made it through Zaha's academy, even with the less than satisfactory grades her parents disapproved of. She'd just have to do that again, this time for 5 more years. 5 long, dull years. She then looked at the popcorn ceiling above, knowing well that summer vacation would come to a close as soon as her eyelids shut. So she kept looking and looking, well into the night. "Betty!" a voice bellowed from above. She moaned, "Betty, it's time to wake up." Squinting her eyes, Betty briefly saw a round object of slight pink and white. Then it cleared into something familiar. It was Paddy, staring quite happily at her, sideways. "What time is it?" she groaned, rising from her bed. "Nearly 6, come on." It merely felt like she just closed her eyes not long ago, but as she stared around, the faint blue light of dawn dipping into the room confirmed it was indeed morning. Paddy aided Betty to the side of her bed, into her slippers, and out the bedroom. "I've given much lead time for you. You shouldn't be late for your first day of school." Betty treated the morning like any other, little effort, but Paddy treated it otherwise. She helped with her hair, her face and her clothes. Paddy's enthusiasm made it feel like it was her first day. Perhaps Betty could convince her to take her place. Paddy could go to Thermadore while she gets an extra week break before going to magical law in New Jersey. If only she could also dodge school there as well. The two then convened on the kitchen table where eggs and ham awaited them. Betty briefly gazed up at Paddy as she finished her ham. She'd seen those eyes before, very rare, though distinctive. They were normally accompanied with a red face, especially when they had boys or men over. "Could you stop looking at me like that? I'm not Patrick." "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way." She then gazed somewhere else, her stare still dreamlike. "You really like the school, don't you?" Betty remarked while stuffing her mouth with scrambled eggs. Having finished breakfast, both the girls and Janetta then returned to Betty's room to finalise everything before departure. "Now please remember that knot for next time. I placed instructions in your trunk should you forget," Janetta said while adjusting Betty's necktie. "Thank you," Betty reacted. Janetta then walked back and levitated a mirror in front of her. She stared back at black box pleats, white socks, a button-up shirt and black tie. "Don't forget the shoes and robe," Janetta said. Betty dropped the black polished Mary Janes on the floor. As she placed her feet in the shoes, the metal buckles wrapped around and spontaneously tightened till they were snug. "I love them," Betty reacted. She then placed herself in the school robes. As expected, a snug fit. She twisted her body one more time while looking at the mirror, amused by the way it rose. "Beautiful," Janetta remarked. "Radical," Paddy said, sitting on Betty's bed. "Well, looks like you're done, Betty." Janetta then pointed her wand at an open trunk. It closed and immediately stood up next to the suitcases near the bedroom door. "Aren't you excited?" Paddy gushed. Betty nodded with a feeble smile. "Not as much as you, Paddy." It was time for departure. As Betty made her way downstairs to the family room, her eyes met Thorny, who smiled proudly back at her as their mother adjusted her uniform. Betty sat quietly nearby, looking at the two of them. Thorny's attire was similar to Betty's, black skirt, long socks and white button-up shirt. Instead of black robes, Thorny's was a pale blue, the edges on the robes and collar, red. It didn't open up like Betty's, but was tied up by a golden pin that looked like twigs in a circular pattern. Paddy then arrived and sat next to Betty. "Whatever house you end up in, they will have gained an excellent student. I'm very proud of you," Mother Grimes said to Thorny. They hugged. Betty scoffed. "Houses, that sounds so stupid, so self-important." "Don't worry about Thorny," Paddy reacted. "Come on, it's time to leave." It was early enough that the air felt crisp. Dew barely developed on the large lawn that surrounded the house, and the sun rose just above the tree line in the east. Betty, with one suitcase, went through the front doors. Janetta walked behind, using her impressive levitating abilities to move the rest of her belongings. The black Ford station wagon was parked right off the entrance with its rear open. Both Betty and Janetta carefully placed the items in and slammed the door shut. "Well, I guess this is it, Betty, another school year." Betty frowned. "But I'll be miles away, Janetta." Janetta chuckled and got down to her level. "Don't worry, I'll find a way to send the ginger snaps before the end of the year." "Once I get there, I'll send you a picture of my room window," Betty said. "I don't know, Betty. Pittsburgh is pretty far. Besides, even if I find your room, I don't know much about the school." "Guess mailing works," Betty said grimly. Zaha's academy had explicit rules regarding visitors and mail, but that didn't stop Janetta giving Betty treats through her bedroom window in the cabin she resided while at the academy. Wouldn't Thermadore be any different? The front door then opened. Betty had never seen Paddy with a more severe smile. "You're still in a good mood," Betty remarked. "Oh, Betty, you'll understand when you get there." The front door opened once again. Out the door came both Grimes' parents, who were in conversation while Thorny held tight to her mother's robes. As they approached, it looked more like arguing. "Don't worry, we'll make it in time, Vivian," Father Grimes said. Mother Grimes, amidst the conversation, gave Paddy a look. "Pads, is it okay if we send you back in the afternoon?" Paddy sighed. "But Mum, my stuff are already in the car." "We can always make room," Mother Grimes said. Paddy rolled her eyes. "I'll just join you with Dad and Thorny to Ilvermorny." "Thank you, dear." Father Grimes then cleared his throat while looking at his wife. "Yes," Vivian reacted. She then slowly approached Betty. "Betty, you better be on your best behaviour. I don't want to hear trouble from you." A brief silence then ensued as all family members and Janetta looked between Mother Grimes and Betty. "And please have a wonderful year there, dear." Betty smiled. She ran towards her mum and hugged. "I love you, Mum." Mother Grimes placed her arms around her. "Love you too, Betty." "All right, let's not waste more time," Father Grimes yelled. With Paddy's belongings back in, the view out the rear of the vehicle opened up to Mother Grimes, Thorny and Janetta, who waved at them as they moved out the property and through the wrought iron gates. The vehicle then turned right, headed west. "Betty, please buckle yourself in." "Sorry, Dad." Betty made her way to the middle seat and buckled up. She stared happily at him and Paddy at the front bench. The car then took off and soared high in the sky. The sun was much more noticeable once they reached level flight. As they were headed west, its beams penetrated through the open back window and reflected directly to Betty's eyes from the front mirrors. Betty quickly raised her hand to block. "Dad, the sun is blinding me." "Oh, sorry, dear." Father Grimes pressed a button on the 5th row, 8 to the right. All the mirrors, including the rear view mirror, then disappeared. Much better. Paddy's window was still open. Wind blew in, but it wasn't overbearing and, surprisingly, not cold. Betty did feel a bit anxious. They passed metropolitan New York City and headed into the green outskirts. Betty, not amused of the view out the window, focused on the endorsement pamphlet for Thermadore. It displayed blurry images of the interior of the school. It looked fancy, like an 18th century castle. "Paddy, you said Thermadore was originally a mansion, right?" Paddy looked back. "Yes, it was owned by the people it was named after." "But don't you think that's a silly place to put a school? There's like 1,000 of us. How can you fit that many people in? Paddy smiled. I'll let you figure that one out. Betty scoffed. Stop acting so cryptic with me, I want answers. Paddy then looked forward, her blonde-white hair once again fluttering from the open window. Passing cloud cover, patches of greenery turned into tarmac and concrete as the city of Pittsburgh became visible off the horizon. The black Ford station wagon then began its descent towards the surface, much faster than Betty expected. It's not downtown. Pretty close, actually, Paddy responded while opening a large map. Eventually they touched tarmac and drove down yet another 2-lane road. There was a sudden onslaught of suburban homes as they passed by. It seemed they landed in a neighborhood. Dad, are you sure you know where you're going? Betty panicked. Of course I know where I'm going. Father Grimes responded. That's why I brought Paddy along. It's this left, Paddy suddenly yelled. Father Grimes turned the wheel so violently it caused the car tires to squeal. Dad, watch out! The car swerved through an opening between a group of old people crossing the street. As they passed, Betty saw their non-reacting faces through the passenger window. Seconds later, Betty saw them continuing down the road as though nothing happened. They didn't see that? Betty reacted. Luckily for my driving skills, they didn't, Father Grimes said with a proud smile. Paddy scoffed, and no Madge cloaking was useful as well. The new direction Paddy instructed was much less interesting. Like the road home, they were surrounded by trees. There was nearly 30 minutes of it, no indication of them getting closer to downtown Pittsburgh. Betty felt they turned down the wrong road. But if they did, it didn't matter. It wasn't like she was eager to be there. They passed intersections of roads leading to homes deep inside the dense trees, similar to their own. Betty tried counting them one by one for amusement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They got bigger as she progressed. 13, 14, 15. They were now the size of mansions, some even resembling medieval castles. The road then sloped much higher, the houses not looking any smaller as they carved through. It wasn't until Betty counted to 23 when things got interesting, very interesting. Her eyes widened and jaw dropped. Paddy looked in the same direction, briefly glancing over at her younger sister with a grin. It was a mansion indeed. Bright beige brick exterior complemented by a dark grey roof. But it was the size that shocked Betty. The width of the building was at least 1/4 of a mile, no trees in sight. She could briefly see the Pittsburgh skyline just behind it, blurred by the atmosphere. The entrance was just as extraordinary as the building itself. Large hedges up to Betty's window stood proudly and organised in a complex formation of mazes. They drove down a beige gravel road. Betty looked at both sides. Flanking them were not only the hedges but patches of flowers and many people walking around in groups or alone in the maze. They wore the exact same robes, just like Betty's, black wool, a yellow pinstripe around the waist, and bright yellow insides with the Thermadore insignia embroidered on their right. As they reached the entrance, a large fountain of a witch with water sprouting out her wand came into view. The Ford station wagon drove around it and stopped in front of the school. Betty stared. It was 3 floors high, hundreds of windows placed on its beige surface, all pane, all intricate. The dark oak French entrance doors extruded out from the beige surface, bordered by much smaller bricks. Betty was so amazed, she didn't notice the hand and lip imprints she made on the car window. "Welcome to your new home," Paddy remarked. The car doors swung open. Betty leaped to her feet and quickly ran closer. It was not only wide but very tall. It easily tripled the height of their home. "Don't forget your stuff, Betty," Father Grimes remarked. He placed her trunks and suitcases on the light gravel ground near the hedges. Betty quickly ran back to the car and took her backpack and pamphlet, stuffing the pamphlet into her bag. "Paddy, why didn't you tell me Thermadore was so big?" Paddy chuckled. "I told you I wouldn't say much till we got here. I didn't want to spoil the surprise." Betty couldn't resist a smile. She looked up at the large school, completely impressed by its facade. "You don't think the No Madge will notice?" Betty said. "No, they won't. The road leading up here is hidden from them. Only magic folk drive here," Paddy said, pointing at the road. That's why it was so empty, Betty reacted. I guess this side of Pittsburgh is less populated with people like us. Betty looked around. There were other vehicles near the fountain, all of them dropping off kids and their belongings as well. At the front stood 3 Greyhound buses with a pile of trunks and suitcases on its side. The students were a very diverse group. Betty hadn't seen such a variety of people before. Some wore accessories on their robes, like pins near the Thermadore insignia, and others had things in their exterior pockets. These robes have pockets, Betty reacted, placing both hands in the pockets. Yes, you haven't noticed them, Paddy reacted, completely dumbfounded. I guess I haven't been wearing it long enough. Betty! A familiar voice sprouted behind her. Paisley, Gabrielle! They both rushed towards her and hugged. Glad to see you. How are you liking Thermadore so far? Paisley said. I'm just so surprised it's so big, Paisley. Paisley grinned. Wait till you get inside. Hey, Paddy! Hey, Mr. Grimes! Gabrielle approached the two. Hey, Gabrielle! Father Grimes reacted. You girls excited? Of course, Gabrielle reacted. You girls will love it, Paddy said. Paisley, I know you know. Paisley smiled at her. How's law school, Paddy? Paisley asked. Paddy's smile suddenly turned grim. 2 words, too much. I mean, why do they expect so much from us? I'm just 2 years in. Sounds tough. I'm sure you'll manage, Gabrielle commented. You better keep notes, Paddy. I'll need them once I'm enrolled, Paisley said. Noted, Paddy said, sweetly. Father Grimes took a brief look at the school, then at his watch. It's time to go, Paddy. Girls, good luck. Father Grimes shook both friends' hands and gave Betty a firm hug. I love you, Betty, and the best of luck. Please stay safe. I will, Dad, Betty smiled. He ruffled Betty's hair before heading back to the car. Paddy hugged both girls, then approached Betty. There was a brief silence as they both stared at each other. Betty tried to not smile. Paddy suddenly launched herself onto her in the firmest hug Betty felt all summer. She only had the sting of mint from Paddy's perfume to put her off. I love you, Betty. Please write me. I will, Paddy. Both Paddy and Father Grimes waved at the 3 girls before entering the vehicle. Then they drove off, leaving a cloud of dust. Well, we made it, Paisley said, as the 3 continued towards the door. They stopped and gazed. It was much larger than Betty thought, nearly quadrupling her in height. Where's Pearl? Betty said. Not here yet, Gabrielle reacted. I think she planned to do something. Planning what? Being her, she might want to make a good first impression, so she probably put extra work on her first day outfit, Paisley said. It's not only that, guys. Gabriel pointed to a dozen cars driving as a convoy towards the school. They parked near the front of the entrance. The largest vehicle, which stood in the middle, had the Winters family crest embroiled on the rear door. As the door opened, a great cloud of smoke puffed out, obscuring the interior. 2 people came out, both in bright purple attire, a woman and man, both grey-haired but exceptionally young-looking. The lady wore a long, silky purple gown that glittered in the sun. The man's suit acted the same. Their faces pale with subtle signs of blush. The lady's lips were the same colour as her gown. Their movements were elegant and soft as they approached the girls. Paisley, Gabrielle and Betty, how are things? The man said in his deep and relaxed voice. Hey, Mr. Winters, Betty reacted. Oh, my dears. The lady kissed each girl on the cheek. They all wiped their faces to make sure the purple hadn't stained. Good to see you all. This school, is it really as good as your father puts it, Paisley? Yes, Mrs. Winters. All my family graduated here and look how we turned out. Mrs. Winters squinted at the lone redhead. Yes, askew but good. You all turned out somewhat good. Both Betty and Gabrielle snorted. When will we see our friend? Gabrielle requested. The Winters couple smiled. Mr. Winters then pointed at the vehicle as though presenting. Out came 2. They held hands. The taller of the 2 had ruffled hair, his face sharp and his eyes a soft glow. Next to him, a much shorter person, her face just as pale as the Winters couple, and her lips and robes as dazzling purple as her mother's. Hamilton has gone insane. It's Scotty Gunther, a girl yelled from behind the friend group. Suddenly, like a pack of vultures spotting a carcass, tens of dozens of people ran towards the two, most of them girls. They all began to shriek. The girl next to the tall man quickly ran towards the friend group. The tall man was completely surrounded by the onslaught of Thermadore students wanting a piece of him. "Geez, people, chill out." His voice was too soft. He didn't seem like the type to scream or react aggressively. Suddenly, the other vehicles began releasing a drove of bigger men in dark attire, attempting to move the screaming fans from the taller individual. "That's enough! Back away!" one of them said in their intimidating voice. "Ah, my sunshine," Mr. Winters said while presenting his daughter. "Just like my beautiful Daphne." Mrs. Winters blushed. "How did you manage to get Scotty? I thought he was on tour," Gabrielle said. "Guess he made time for me," Pearl reacted, smiling. Gabrielle smiled back. "What a kind person." Both Betty and Paisley looked at each other in disbelief. "Mr. and Mrs. Winters, we require your assistance," another dark-haired gentleman yelled amongst the growing crowd. "Pearl, your stuff is over there. If you have any questions, write us," Mr. Winters said very quickly, almost out of character. "We love you, dear. Girls, please take care of my daughter," Mrs. Winters added. The Winters then quickly ran towards the tall man to help set him free from his adoring fans. "Wow, what an entrance," Betty remarked. Pearl looked at the three with her nose high. "I told you I'd make an impression." Paisley sighed. "You definitely did. I'm sure the age gap was impressionable." She then noticed Pearl's dazzling purple school robes. "Also, robes aren't to be altered, Pearl. Haven't you read the guidelines?" Pearl scoffed. "Am I sensing jealousy?" Paisley slapped her forehead in frustration. Pearl got closer to her. "Remember, this is all to get closer to August. We'll be together. You'll see, Paisley." Paisley didn't even look at her, instead focusing on the school. "Come on, let's go," she said. "We don't want to keep Thermadore waiting." The four made their way through the dark oak French doors. A large entrance hall greeted them on the other side. It was nearly thrice the size of the one in Wyoming, but much, much more impressive. It was an orchestra of the most intricate and expensive-looking things Betty had ever seen. Ornate gold trimmed everything, the furniture, pillars and walls. The floors were a checkered black and white tiled base under plush red carpet that stretched centred into 4 large hallways on the main floor. There were paintings of figures of knights, outdoors men, navy men and women in ball gowns dancing, placed on the ivy-green walls. In front of them stood a large staircase that led to an even more impressive hall up to the second floor. It too received an excessive amount of gold treatment, including on the handrails, balusters and even risers. Betty then looked up. There were drawn wizards and witches, many kinds of them on the ceiling. Unlike the paintings, these ones stood still. Betty was reminded of a similar-looking ceiling when her family visited a structure in Rome. They all pointed their wands at a serpent-looking creature that stretched and slithered around chandeliers that evenly repeated in the halls. "Oh, what a place!" Gabrielle said, awestruck. "Impressive, isn't it?" Paisley said. "Just looks like the manor my family went to in France in July," Pearl added, trying to hide her amusement. "Paddy never told me it would look like this," Betty said, looking around. They all approached a small crowd of similarly dressed kids gathered at the stairwell. "What are they waiting for?" Pearl said. "The headmaster," Paisley responded. 2 taller students stood opposed to the crowd on the first steps of the stairs. The girl had the oddest hue of pink on her head that Betty had ever seen on a person. "Who are the 2 gargoyles in the front?" Pearl said. "Pearl!" Paisley reacted. "Be nice, they're the high students." "High students? Is that what you called the older students here?" "No, Pearl, think of them like the minions of the headmaster," Paisley explained. Pearl rolled her eyes. Sounds like someone can't do their job. As they gathered with the group, Betty then noticed from both hallways flanking them, groups of much older students running towards the front doors. "Is he really there?" one of them said. "It really is him," said another. Then at the top of the stairs, a balding grey-haired man in dark robes came down. his robes preventing him from going down any faster. "What has happened?" he said. One of the high students looked up at him. "Seems one of the new students brought in a celebrity." "A celebrity? Why?" The high student shrugged. "Oh, that doesn't matter. Go out and shoo them away and tell the students to come in quickly." The two high students quickly ran to the entrance to quell the chaos outside. "Look what you did, Pearl," Paisley whispered. The headmaster stood with his arms back, his posture proud. His eyes scanned through the crowd of students. Betty felt uneasy. He reminded her of someone very familiar. Suddenly, a large wave of students began flooding the main hall. Some dispersed in the halls, flanking the crowd, while the others joined them. The two high students, the last to enter, then made their place back to the front of the crowd on the first step. "Welcome, students, to the Thermadore Wizarding Academy. I'm your headmaster, Mr. Freebottom. Since its foundation, Thermadore stands to make sure that all those who step foot on these grounds have all the opportunities given them to maximize their potential and become effective members of both wizard and non-wizard society. I am privileged to be your tour guide for the day, shall we?" The headmaster then climbed up the stairs, the high students following. Soon after, the crowd followed the three like a pack of sheep, heading up and deeper in the school. The crowd gazed at the magnificence of the hall around them as they followed the three, gasps and other noises leaving their mouths in amazement. Pearl seemed to be the only one not amused. "It's like I'm in a castle," one student said. "It's like Versailles," a tall, chestnut-haired boy uttered behind the friend group. "You've been there, Ryan," Gabrielle responded. A row of golden pane windows emerged from the corner as they turned right at a concourse. The group all gasped in excitement. Through the window stood a large garden area, completely surrounded. There were students in the garden area traversing the open paths while others stood around tall trees and some on stone benches placed throughout. "Ah, yes, the courtyard. As you can see, it's completely surrounded by the school walls. It's the most central place of our school. Should you get lost, I believe the courtyard is a good starting point." The crowd continued down the hall, most of them close to the windows, observing the central outdoor area. "Yes, Gabrielle, I've been to Versailles. This place looks exactly like it, even down to the gold trim," Ryan responded. "Funny thing you mention that, Ryan," Paisley said. "Did you know Thermadore was once considered the Versailles of the Americas? It even won the 1949 Enchantment Architect Award." "Why didn't it win the other past ones?" Ryan asked. "Dunno, I guess that's when the school went through renovations." "Interesting. They renovated it to look like my grandma's 100-year-old villa in Maine," Pearl said. "Thermadore is most common for churning out academic accolades from our alumni, but we also take pride in our competitive leagues as well. Brodie Wilson, Henry Donello and a few others all had their humble beginnings in these very halls." "Don't forget to mention Millicent Bradley," a boy at the back yelled. "Ah, yes, Millicent, the team leader of the New York Griffin Wolves. How could I forget her?" "She's my favourite Elementa player, you know," Ryan told the friend group. "I've seen her play live. She does look impressive," Betty said. "And so, to provide those of you who prefer this route of achievement, our school offers the best sporting facilities in the Northeast," the headmaster said. On their left, across a dozen large panes of glass, stood a large gymnasium. The theme was no different, ivy green walls accented with gold trim, though not as magnificent as the hall they were in. Suddenly, the far wall of the gymnasium opened up. A large opera bear resisted the ropes of 4 students trying to pull it on the gymnasium floor. The first years all ran towards the glass pane to see the action. Eventually, it reached far enough in the gymnasium that the walls closed behind it. The 4 still struggled. The opera bear suddenly rose on its back 4 feet and began clawing around with its forefront. "They're gonna die," one student yelled. The sound of muffled arguments and screams came through the glass pane. Betty noticed the headmaster and high students completely calm from the situation. "Are we not going to do something about it?" a student yelled. The 3 didn't respond. Suddenly, the opera bear spun around so violently it caused one of the 4 to lift off from their rope. Everyone gasped. The unlucky fellow flew and flared around like paper in the wind. Then suddenly, like a slingshot, they were launched from their rope towards the glass pane, towards the students. They all dived away from the glass. There was a loud thud, and then a low rumble of the glass vibrating. Everyone stood up and saw the Opera Bear handler stuck on the wall like a bug. As you can see, students, we also take safety very seriously. We go out of our way to make sure your learning process doesn't take that much of a toll on your physical health, the headmaster explained. They all looked at the victim, still stuck on the glass, surprisingly no cracks. The headmaster approached the victim and gave him a thumbs up. The victim gave a thumbs up back before his body began sliding down the glass pane. See? No harm done. The student on the glass landed on the padded corner of the gymnasium with a thud. All the students winced. The Opera Bear is an animatronic built by our magical mechanics team to help our magic creature hunters practice. We also built an ocelox, mountain badger, scaled eagle, and a griffon wolf. Everyone gasped. A griffon wolf? One student reacted. Yes, we tried our best to replicate one, and we got close. Due to this, only final years who have gone through hunting qualifications are allowed to work with it. It might be the only animatronic that could cause severe harm. Everyone went silent. The headmaster then smiled. Well, let's get going. We have no time to waste. The headmaster, the two high students and the crowd of students continued down the hall, then turned right through a set of dark green metal doors. As they passed through, a large waft of slightly foul-smelling air disturbed Betty's nostrils. It was warm and very rubbery, with a hint of armpit. The facility we've just experienced out those doors belongs to the Magical Creatures Hunting elective. This hallway leads to the rest of our physical activity facilities. On our right is the traditional no-maj gym. The students all stopped to look at the underwhelming facility. It was filled with thin metal contraptions with wires spun around them, large round metal slabs on cabinet-looking supports. At the far end, platforms with metal bars protruding what looked like metal tables and a dozen stationary bicycle contraptions, all reflected by a large mirror covering the right wall. The no-maj have had a very good understanding of our physical bodies. These machines help facilitate that according to our no-maj studies department. If you find yourself enrolled in that elective, you might find yourself using these devices. Shall we? No, mages are very odd, Pearl reacted. They could simply create an elixir that can solve those problems rather than doing whatever that is. Remember, magic isn't something available to them, Pearl. They've got to make do with what they have. Paisley reacted. Lame. They all continued down the hall. More empty gymnasium facilities flanked them. They then stood at the glass barrier of a facility which held two heavily dressed older students with wands out and in stances ready to attack each other. Ah, yes, our dueling facility. No finer place to resolve an argument. Usually I prefer peaceful resolutions, but if the arguments do become severe enough, I recommend, with safety of course, to have them here rather than in the halls. Incarcerus! One muffled through the glass. Bombarda! The other. Streams of bright light bounced all over the facility, and through the glass where unsuspecting eyes were blinded. As everyone recovered, one of the duelists laid flat on the floor while the other began padding out the fire worn around him. Don't worry, they're both perfectly fine, the headmaster said. Though her friends stared in fright of the aftermath, Betty couldn't stop herself from smiling. The intensity of the violent but brief encounter across the glass somehow amused her. And at the edge of the facility, our most popular sport, Elementa. Ryan and some other students then ran toward much larger glass walls at the end of the hall, hands and faces flat. The others stood back, watching. Across it stood a large cobblestone arena filled with 8-foot-tall pillars that spread throughout. The students in the arenas were casting spells, not stunning or disarming ones, but ones related to elements. Fire protruded out of the wand of a boy student near the middle, while a female student levitated hundreds of tiny pebbles and dropped it on those near her. Then a male player manipulated a stream of water and launched it at a large burst to the female student. A male student not far from the violence leaped on the 8-foot pillars towards them, gliding like a leaf caught in the wind. As he got close, he pointed his wand at them and they fell to the floor as though being pushed. They're the best in the Northeast and our chance to win the New Jersey Cup. They are preparing for the match on Wednesday against Botham. I expect a good match, the headmaster said. Betty noticed he seemed to take a lot of interest in this side of the facility. She remembered Paddy always obsessing over the school's team. They were good when she was there, but Paddy wasn't the sports type. Perhaps it was a boy in the team. After leaving the facilities and traversing many long hallways, the group of students alongside the headmaster and the two high students then made their way towards the rear entrance of the school. Greeting them was a large, deep green field of grass that felt like it stretched forever towards barriers of very tall hedges. Here we are, the back of the school. On your right, the herbology and magical creatures facility. Everyone's head pointed right. A couple of small hedges nestled a brown barn attached to a large greenhouse. At the base of both structures carried a large layer of thick vines. And on your left, our Elementa playing field. It wasn't much of a field, more like a large gravel pit. "Where's the field?" one student yelled. The headmaster turned his head. "It's a surprise," he said with a grin. "Another surprise? Now I'm understanding where Paddy gets it from," Betty said. "It's just hidden, that's all," Paisley answered. "Thank you. It's a wonderful place to spend your free time, but there's more." The high students ran on the trimmed lawn and flopped on the grass. The group of students gasped. "You'll ruin your clothes," Gabriel yelled. "Will they?" the headmaster said, placing himself onto the lawn. "Go along, try it." They were hesitant, but slowly made their way to the lawn. It was soft, much softer than the red carpets inside, almost like fresh snow, but no imprints left behind. One student lowered themselves on the soft grass and laid on it. The smile they gave off surprised them. Slowly, people began following suit. Betty sat on her bum. It was like jello. It wobbled slightly as it settled around her. She then flopped down completely. Like a bed, the ground softened the fall. The prickly nature of the thick grass felt good in her hands, legs, and scalp. "It's nice, try it." Her friends were hesitant, but eventually Paisley went first, then Gabrielle, who flopped right next to her. Betty felt their weight unsettle the ground beneath, which made her body spring up and down briefly. "Oh my goodness, I didn't know about this," Paisley reacted. "It's so soft," Gabrielle said. They began doing grass angels. "Come on, Pearl, it's fine," Betty said. Pearl stood staring anxiously at them. "I don't know, I really like this robe." "If the high students and the headmaster approve, I'm sure it's fine," Paisley added. Pearl looked around. She was one of a few left standing. She finally lowered herself down until her back was flat on the grass. "It's very soft," Pearl commented. "I love it," Paisley said. Betty briefly stared at each of her friends, then looked up. Luckily, the sun was covered by a large cloud in the empty blue sky. The sound of soft conversation, trees chirping, and the distant lawnmower sang in her ears. The headmaster made his way around the group. "Gleramide grass, this is. It was recently installed this year by one of our benefactors. It's supposed to feel like a very soft bed." The headmaster then laid himself down on a much more open part of the grassy field. "This backyard is meant as a relaxing area for you students. We were told it would boost your school performance." He then sighed in satisfaction. "It boosted my work performance." They all laid in silence as the distance noises did their work, complemented by a sudden cold breeze that brushed through all of them. "Headmaster, is that where we're staying?" Paisley said. Everyone's heads then rose to look where Paisley pointed. There were two large compact buildings across the field. They resembled so closely to the school's exterior as Betty stared back and forth, though they were much taller, at least 5 stories high. They stood at the border of the property where the tall hedges laid with a statue of a winged horse between them, all as the Pittsburgh skyline shone brightly in the background. "That's exactly right, your dormitories, boys on the left and girls on the right. More will be said about them once it's time to reside for the evening, but please take a chance to relax." Their heads all went down. The cloud that covered the sun nearly finished its path, slowly brightening the grassy field and blinding unsuspecting eyes. "And our last stop on our tour is my favourite." The group of students, along with the headmaster and 2 high students, approached a narrow hallway where 2 French doors laid. As they entered, they found themselves on a tall bridge, crossing an enormous room where at the bottom laid thousands of bookshelves that reached up to their height. Books flew around the ceiling, occasionally diving towards their heads. They all ducked when they did. "Welcome to the library. You might be asking yourself, what are we doing up here?" the headmaster said. He positioned himself near an open section of the guardrails of the bridge. His feet neared the edge as he slowly walked backwards. "Be careful!" Gabriel yelled. The headmaster smiled and dropped himself. Everyone but the high students gasped and quickly ran toward the rails. He was perfectly fine at the bottom, looking up at them. "See? I'm all right. The library is accessible to both floors. The second floor has no stairs, so this is the only way down." The high students then leaped off the opening of the bridge. They fluttered gently like feathers toward the ground and landed right next to him. "I don't know if I can do that," one student said. "Come on, guys," Ryan said to them. He leaped just as the high students did. His fall was just as soft, but he didn't position himself correctly, causing him to land on his belly. They all gasped. "It's all right, I'm fine," he yelled after getting up. "It's not bad, guys." They were hesitant. Some even backed away. Betty felt compelled to go next. "Wait, Betty, you're going?" Pearl reacted. Betty put one foot off the ledge. She closed her eyes and leaned over. A rush of air quickly formed, but it suddenly ceased. She opened one eye. Her body was still descending, but much, much slower than she expected. Her feet then contacted the floor and she walked it off. "It's that easy." Betty approached Ryan. "You made it look easy," Ryan remarked. Betty then joined Ryan and the others, looking up at the heads poking off the ledge. "It's okay, take your time," the headmaster said. Paisley went next. She screamed once she went off, but it stopped as soon as she noticed her fall was gentle. She wagged her legs, while in the air then landed just as seamless as Betty. "Not bad," Paisley said with a smile. She approached Betty and joined the others to look up. With enough time and convincing, they began dropping down one by one. Some fell just like Ryan, while others landed gracefully. Some even attempted to do flips or twists while in the air. Once it was Pearl's turn, she gracefully leaped and performed a pirouette all the way down, which caused the group to gasp and even clap. As she landed, she bowed. Her group of friends approached her. "Impressive," Betty said. "Thank you." Pearl then stared at Paisley smugly. "Love the confidence, I'm so proud of all of you." The headmaster looked pleased. "Well then, let's explore our library." The library wasn't only large but long. Like the main halls, it stretched far. Other second-story bridges crossed through it, although they were much lower than the one they dropped off. The noon sun pierced through the glass-pane windows, giving light to the dark yet cosy place. There were many, many shelves, filled to the brim with books. Small gathering areas occasionally sprouted between them, where long and large round conference tables resided, but the shelves took a majority of the area, tall, tall shelves, some of them nearly reaching the ceiling. "This room will be a vital part of your life for the next 5 years. I know it seems daunting, but please familiarise yourself with the library. It will be very useful, especially during exam time." The group stopped at one of the many extremely tall bookshelves. Now you might be wondering, how in Hamilton's mind is anyone able to reach the top? The headmaster approached the bookshelf and tapped his foot. Suddenly, like a leaf, he flew all the way to the top. Some in the crowd screamed. He then laughed. Never gets old. Anyways, below the floors of each tall bookshelf contains a special metal platform created and prepared for self-levitation. It's the exact same contraption that gently brought you all down here. "So that means we can go up back on the bridges?" One in the crowd yelled up at him. "Precisely, it's what makes traversing this library feel so easy and somewhat amusing. Ingenious those goblins are." The headmaster then looked through a row of books. He grabbed a light turquoise one. His descent was quick, which caused him to land with a loud thud on the wooden floor. They all jumped back in response. That's what 20 years of practice looks like. He then opened the book and quickly scanned through it. Botanica Instinct by Diana Inavra, a wonderful read for fourth-year herbology. As soon as his sharp eyes stared back at the crowd, some of them then rummaged through their backpacks, took out parchment and began scribbling violently. Such exemplary children. Which reminds me. He slammed the book shut with one hand and sprouted his wand with another. "Reversio!" he yelled while he flicked the wand. A breeze of air flowed through them. As they opened their eyes, nothing seemed to change. "My robes!" Pearl yelled. Everyone looked at her. They weren't sparkly purple anymore, now another robe among a sea of same-looking attire. "May I remind you all that, as students of this school, I expect you to present your best. In academia, in attitude and in appearance, there are strict guidelines with our dress code. There will not be alterations to our standard robes. Although this school does celebrate diversity, it's also a place of collective identity. We've decided uniform appearance brings us closer to this goal, so the robes are to be left untouched. This tour was merely just a dribble of what this school offers. I'd show you more, but we've run out of time. But don't hesitate to ask questions to staff, teachers, or even older students about anything. My hope is that you'll learn to love this place as much as I." He then pointed at the two high students. Jeremy and Millicent and many others do. Large doors on their right opened up. "Now then, would you all care to join us for lunch?" The crowd then followed the headmaster out of the library, while Betty and her friends stood back to attend to Pearl, who was in tears. "It's all right, Pearl, you're still you," Betty said. "It's not fair, my mum and I worked all day yesterday on it," Pearl uttered. "Are we done here, girls?" The pink-haired high student reacted. All four girls glared at her. "Yes, we're coming," Betty said irritably. Back in the halls, the friend group along with the female high student made their way toward the cafeteria. Pearl glared at the pink-haired high student, looking as though she might cause her harm. "Collective identity," Pearl scoffed. "Yes, Pearl," Paisley reacted. "Thermadore embraces community." Pearl looked away. "Sounds like communism to me." "Ham, white cheese, lettuce and tomatoes. Is this what they call lunch?" Pearl gazed at the packed sandwich on the tray in her hands. It was a vast cafeteria, round metal grated tables placed throughout on the main floor and second-story balcony surrounding the large area. In the north stood a massive window overlooking the courtyard and permitting an overwhelming amount of the late afternoon sun to enter. "Can we go up there?" Paisley said, pointing at the balcony. "And talk to older students? No chance," Pearl reacted. The first years were packed in one section of the cafeteria, far from the courtyard windows. The four sat close to their own table, making sure they weren't far from them. It wasn't long till the large cafeteria was piled on by a flood of students heading for the food counters, causing a line to form that stretched past the entrance. "I guess that's the rest of the school," Betty said, observing their casual nature and taller stature. "What a bunch of posers," Pearl remarked. "They're just waiting for the food. I don't see what's wrong with that," Paisley said. They stood confident, conversing with smiles. "They look too happy. I mean, who smiles at school?" "I do. I love it here," Paisley said, smiling. "I don't know, Pearl. I'm liking Thermadore," Gabriel added, her smile just as big as Paisley's. Pearl scoffed. Tables were now occupied, both on the first floor and on the balcony. With more of the school present, Betty and her friends couldn't stop themselves looking at the filled tables, figuring out who was who in the school. The smart ones were very apparent, with books on their faces, leaving their meals half-eaten. The theatrical type laughed the most. The four girls couldn't understand what could make them so hysterical. The troubled types were the messiest. Slices of ham and tomatoes, lettuce leaves and drops of mayonnaise were spread all over the table and floor around them as they devoured their lunches like a pack of wolves. Those who finished attempted to throw their napkins towards the trash bin, leaving crumples of paper lying around. What also gave them away was the higher amount of teacher traffic around their area. "That's disgusting," Pearl added, clearly disturbed. And finally, across from them at the back corner of the cafeteria, held the most students. They surrounded a small group of boys and girls. "The Elementa players," Paisley said. "The one with the girl in his arms is probably the team captain." A dirty blonde-haired boy held a girl close to him. She had her head on his chest while holding his right hand. With the other, he gestured while he talked. "Yep, he's definitely the captain," Paisley remarked. The large crowd of students fixated on him. It was uncanny how attentive they were. Suddenly, the crowd burst into laughter, much louder than the theatrical group. Betty wasn't convinced that what he said was funny. He smiled from all the confirmation. The girl smiled back as he looked down at her on his chest. Then his eyes rose back up and pointed at them. "He's looking at us!" Pearl yelled. His stare was long. It seemed no one noticed at his table, including the girl. "Does he like one of us?" Pearl looked at her friends. "Don't be so quick to conclusions, Pearl," Paisley reacted. "Don't you see that he has a girlfriend?" Pearl shook with excitement. "The best part is he's cute. Oh, I'm loving this school right now." The three girls scoffed. "All right, first years," the headmaster announced as he approached them, giving brief glares at the troubled type students. "Bathrooms are on the right of the food counters. Once you've cleaned up after yourselves, meet me at that archway. We'll head for the auditorium in 5 minutes." All at once, the first years stood up and cleaned up their spaces. As Betty scanned around the cafeteria once more, she saw many disapproving stares at her and her first-year classmates. "Are the older students always like this?" Betty said, attending her tray with Paisley. "I mean, my brother did mention the school is filled with the type," Paisley responded. She then got closer. "Look at Pearl, she fits right in," she whispered. Betty couldn't deny the observation. The faces they made as she stared back at them wasn't much different than Pearl's judgmental stares. What could they have done to deserve such disapproval? Betty then gazed back at the Elementa player table. He still was staring. It didn't look disapproving like the rest, as much as Betty didn't want to believe it. It looked more like admiration than anything. A sense of excitement spread through the first years as they approached the entrance doors of the auditorium. Like the school's main entrance, the entrance was wide and tall, flanked by 2 large, dark wooden doors. As they passed, the light-hearted nature of the school halls were replaced by a darker and more solemn ambience. The auditorium looked similar to her family's in Wyoming, but this one felt more European. It wasn't hard for Betty to imagine this exact place somewhere in Milan. Gone were the green and gold. The walls were dark, their colours indistinguishable. They walked down the ramps towards the bottom seating areas. The first years were assisted to the first 3 rows. Betty sat at the edge of her friend group, a dark-haired girl on her right and Gabrielle on her left. Large velvet drapes covered much of the stage. The lanterns pitched on the walls emitted enough to let everyone see where they were going, but not much more. "I wonder what it is," Pearl said. As the first years made themselves comfortable, the drapes then very slowly raised from the wooden floors. "But what about the rest of the school?" Gabrielle said, looking behind her at the sea of empty theatre seats. White leather boots began tapping the wooden floor. Suddenly, the sound of guitars and slow beats of drums boomed in the auditorium. Now the drapes were waist-high. It was a female performer, pacing to the beat of the drums. Her dress parted on both sides of her waist, revealing her legs through the openings. Her boots reached just below her knees. The drapes then reached the performer's neck. 3 men on guitars followed her movements as they played, the drummer leading the flow. The drapes were high enough to reveal golden permed hair and bright hazel eyes contrasted by black mascara. Eventually, the curtains rose to the top. The performer began singing through a silver microphone she held. Her voice was soft, yet confident. "She's so pretty," Gabrielle said in shock. The performer smiled as she sang and danced to the slow beat of the music. Her hazel eyes then went for the 4 girls. Betty fell for them. It was as though she was just performing for her. It felt like staring at a mirror, reflecting back an image of what she should be. Eventually, a slow stream of students filled the rest of the seats, piling up all the way to the terrace high above the stage. The singer then sang more enthusiastically, her movements more energetic. "Whoever she is, I love her," Pearl commented. The performer's expressions were now inviting, staring at Betty. The song ended, her hazel eyes out in the audience, out to Betty. The auditorium suddenly roared with applause and cheering. The first years awkwardly joined in as the performer, guitarist and drummer all bowed. A completely different face popped up as the performer raised her head, gone the golden permed hair and in straight, dark brown hair. Hazel's eyes were replaced by dark ones, complemented by a large batch of brown freckles. "What just happened?" Betty reacted. "Used a polyjuice potion of some sort, I think," Paisley said. Nonetheless, the audience were enjoying it. There were even whistles sprouting from the far back row of auditorium. The guitarist and drummer used levitating spells to walk off to the side of the stage with the equipment, leaving the singer alone. The headmaster then appeared on the other side. "Wonderful, wonderful. Good job, Megan," he said, approaching the performer. "Students, the No-Maj Arts class." The auditorium burst in cheers and applause once again. The singer waved and smiled. As the applause died down, the singer walked off the stage in the same direction as the other performers. That was Magic, by the No-Maj singer Olivia Newton-John. Such a fitting name. Around 50 adults made their way to the stage. "That's our teachers," Pearl said. Betty noticed the odd bunch. Although nothing stark initially came, it was hard to not notice the odd hats, makeup, and even mask up on stage. They stood in a long line behind the headmaster. The headmaster then pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and cleared his voice. "I was born under the care of a loving mother, under a batch of branches in a cosy nest on a spring afternoon. My brother came before me, a proud child and prospective eagle. As we grew up, we relied less on our motherly care. I became a stumbling common quail, barely able to open up my wings to lift myself. My brother, a prodigy of flight, soaring higher than any youngling has ever had. An honourable eagle. Once we left our humble homes, we departed our separate ways. My fate, a responsible albatross, attending younglings of my own with a soulmate. My brother, a beacon for all fathers, a swan for a partner and falcons for kin. He was an eagle exemplified. Our days are thin. I wailed as a raven, dearly missing my late true love. My brother as stiff and firm as a rock, his priority still a beacon to his kin, to me. His inheritance fulfilled, a forged eagle. Our deaths are timely, our souls reap for recognition. Our obituary, my brother made a legend, the life of an eagle. Mine is a simple story, a story of the bird species called me. The headmaster placed the paper in his pocket. A poem written by a local, The Bird and Eagle it's called. As you can notice, we are a school of many, many different backgrounds, a mixture of what the Northeast has to offer. As we start the 1980 to 1981 school year, I want you all to consider, what is it you want to be? We begin another decade, a renewal. This is a chance to try new things, test yourself. It's a new start, and here at Thermadore we'll facilitate that for you all. We hope you take advantage of that and become the best versions of yourselves. Again, new students. The headmaster looked at the first-year students. And returning ones, I welcome you all to Thermadore. Best of luck this year. A flood of students riddled the school halls as the kids overwhelmed the supporting staff out the auditorium after the presentation. "That's it, students," a teacher yelled above the loud crowds. "Please head to the dormitories." "Betty, where are you?" Paisley yelled out. "I'm coming, don't worry." Eventually the crowd eased as it dispersed at the backyard field. "Oh, thank goodness," Paisley said as the four girls got back together again. "Who thought it would be a good idea to send us out all at once?" Pearl remarked. "It only happens once in the year," an older female student remarked behind them. The friend group all looked back at her. "Your first years?" The student reacted, "Welcome." The crowd of people followed the open path towards the two tall buildings the first years briefly saw during their tour. They made their way down towards the statue pitched between them. "A statue of Pegasus. That's interesting," Betty remarked. "My brothers didn't mention that this fountain existed. I would have thought the Thermadores didn't believe in such creatures," Paisley added. "My dad talked with local Greek wizards while on a business trip, and they claim to have seen it. Gabrielle said. Really, your dad believes the horse exists? Paisley turned to Gabrielle. I guess so. Sounds like they're misleading him. I mean, it's all a made-up legend like they're gods, Paisley said. The crowd of students then split into two, girls on the right and boys on the left. They then entered their respective buildings. This building holds all of us, Betty said, while looking at the seemingly endless line of girls that reached the back doors of the school. The absence of ivy green and gold made the whole interior feel less like school. There were wooden walls, ceilings and floors. If anything, Betty felt like she was in a cabin. The size of the interior was almost unimaginable. As they walked through a hallway, Betty noticed the large amount of bedrooms on both sides. There was the occasional open area, filled with couches, desks, fireplace and tables. The older girls began dispersing into their rooms as they moved deeper in. Eventually, they entered a gathering area, indented on the ground floor. On the other side stood the biggest fireplace Betty had ever seen. A bonfire could easily set ablaze in its cobblestone walls. A much smaller fire had been made, but still large enough to keep more than a few dozen people warm. Above them revealed an opening 5 floors high, all protected by wooden railings with small openings spaced evenly and exactly one above the other. Betty looked around for a staircase. How do we get up? Betty asked Paisley. It wasn't long until Betty's question got answered. A bunch of the girls began floating up as though they were under air vents, each girl landing at their desired floors. It's like second nature to them, Gabrielle commented. Betty smiled. I hope our room is at the top. That looks like fun going up and down. The sorting of girls in their respective rooms began to dwindle as the flow of girls entering the building slowed. On the first floor, all the first years, the female high student and 2 other older students stood on the indented base. The pink-haired girl skimmed through a piece of parchment she held, while the first-year girls stared, waiting. Okay, I'll begin listing out the names of you girls into groups. Once your name is said, please move forward. Catherine or Roddy will help you to your rooms, okay? The pink-haired student began calling out names, causing a steady flow of girls to walk towards the front. One of the 2 girls then escorted the groups to their rooms. The first years who had the privilege of living above the main floor flew up to their respective floors. Many of them screamed as they went up. Paisley, Gabrielle, Fatma, Beatrice and Pearl, the high student declared. Betty's friend group went forward. They all stared at her in worry. They can't separate us, Betty said. She followed them up to the front. Hey, Millicent, the pink-haired high student replied to Betty's utterance. Yeah, you. What if we're not satisfied with our groups? Betty said. Millicent squinted at Betty. Then you'll have to suck it up. Betty was taken by surprise. But you don't understand, I need her near me at all times, Pearl interjected. Are you girls serious? The pink-haired high student reacted. Betty and her friend group stared back in frustration. Well, you have to bring that up with the headmaster, because we've already arranged your belongings into your assigned rooms. Then who am I with? Betty reacted. Wait your turn and you'll figure that out, Millicent said. Like the fire next to her, Betty felt flames ignite in her chest, doing her best to hide it. She slowly made her way back in the crowd. You're worried about separating? One first year remarked with a giggle. It's not like you'll never see them, said another. Betty did her best to keep her anger in, but it was getting difficult not to burst. Betty's friend group with their roommates made their way to a nearby base platform. Betty stared in envy as they all flew just below the top floor. Of course they get that floor, Betty muttered to herself. Now then, oh look! Millicent gazed at Betty. Your group is next. Maria, Zara, Ashton and the respectful Betty. Can you come to the front? Betty slowly made her way there, all the girls looking at her. She waited as the 3 others came. 2 dark-haired girls and a freckled redhead made their way to the front. The taller of the dark-haired girls had distinct cat-eye makeup. Okay, girls, could you follow Catherine towards your new room? The girls all followed the older student, Betty close behind them, looking up at the multiple floors above. "First floor? You serious?" Betty remarked to Catherine. "Beggars can't be choosers," Catherine replied. She then went into the room to turn on the lights. The four walked in the small room. 4 beds were placed near the 4 corners of the room, cabinets accompanying them. It smelled stale, like it hadn't been maintained for a while. Betty's belongings were placed on top of the bed across the room, near large windows, displaying a hedge as their outside view. "Of course," Betty murmured. "You'll love it," Catherine commented before leaving. "Well, I guess we start unpacking," one of her roommates said. They all began to open their trunks and suitcases and place their clothes in the cabinets nearby. "Right." Betty stared at the other 3 and then focused on the exit. "I'll be right back," she said while passing them. "You're not unpacking," one of them remarked. She didn't respond but continued out. The gathering room was now empty. She crossed the large open space. Nearing a platform, Betty placed 1 foot. Just as she was about to tap with the other, the high student approached. "What are you doing, Betty? You're supposed to be unpacking." "I'm just getting something from my friends," Betty responded. Millicent squinted. "Well, go on then, but consider unpacking soon. Lights go off at 10. Betty checked her watch. "But it's 6. Millicent chuckled. "Time goes fast when with friends, you know. Just make sure to unpack before then." "Sure thing." Betty tapped the floor twice. She flew multiple feet in the air until she reached the desired floor. It was indeed thrilling. It felt just like an amusement ride. As she landed near the top, she began looking through the rooms for her friends. "Nope, nope, yes." "Betty!" Paisley yelled. The friend group assembled in a hug. Their roommates looked at them in confusion. "Don't worry, I'll send a letter to my dad first thing in the morning," Pearl said. Betty looked around and saw the other girls staring at her. "Don't worry, Pearl, I'll be fine," Betty reacted. "Where's your room?" Gabrielle said while unpacking her stuff. "On the 1st floor," she said grimly. She then noticed the window view. "Wow, it's so beautiful." Betty approached it. The large Pittsburgh skyscrapers stood proudly at a dimming sky turned orange. "I'm not complaining at all," Paisley said. "Betty, although we aren't sleeping in the same room, at least we have classes together," Gabrielle said. "I don't know, Gabrielle. Remember our electives? We took different ones, right?" Paisley said. "Right, I'm taking magical creatures with Pearl," Gabrielle mentioned. "And I'm taking no-mag studies," Paisley said. "Sheesh, I completely forgot about that. I'm taking both," Betty said. "Why did you take on more than one, Betty?" Pearl reacted. "I got the suggestion by Paddy." "You know Paddy is a learning fanatic. Of course she'd suggest that, Betty," Paisley said. "I guess so," Betty confessed. "Look, if it gets hard, just drop one. I'll see what I can do." "If you do plan to drop out of one, make sure to stick with no-mag studies," Paisley said. "That way I don't have to be alone." "No way, she'll be staying with us," Pearl reacted. "Girls, dinner arrived," a voice yelled from outside. "Dinner? Already?" Pearl reacted. "But I barely digested lunch." The large gathering area hosted a dozen very long tables where hundreds of girls sat in as food appeared in front of them. The first years sat at one edge, sitting awkwardly as their older schoolmates devoured their dinners. "Ham, mashed potatoes and gravy?" Pearl examined her plate. "They clearly had a large supply of ham today," Gabrielle added. "It's that redhead over there," Betty tried, pointing with her nose at her nearest roommate. "Oh, okay, and the others?" Paisley demanded. "There's the girl with the cat eyes," Betty pointed at her. "She seems nice," Gabrielle commented. "And that one." The shorter, dark-haired girl sat at the edge of the first years reading a book, her food barely touched. "You've got a bookworm. I'm sure she's exciting to talk to," Pearl said, sarcastically. "Could you be more discreet, Pearl?" Paisley reacted. "You've talked with them yet?" Paisley said, staring back at Betty. "No, not yet." "Are they annoying?" "Pearl," Paisley reacted. "I'll let you know by tomorrow." Betty stared at her roommates once more. She barely got their faces, not even their names. The girls dispersed to their respective rooms to end the night, all except Betty, who decided to be with her friends. They talked and talked well into the night as the three finalised their attire, books and equipment into their cabinets. It was their last day of real freedom before school really started. If Betty couldn't sleep with them, at least they could be together till the sky turned dark. "Betty!" a girl yelled from the entrance of the room. "Millicent!" Betty said in shock. "Have you unpacked yet?" "No, but Go to your room. It's getting late," Millicent directed. Betty quickly looked at her friends and stood up. "Good night, Betty," all of them whispered as Betty left them. She then leaped and glided to the first floor and into her room. Betty did her best to avoid eye contact as she passed. She then used her wand to open her trunk and cabinet. Her clothes and supplies flowed out and into the open shelves next to her bed. "Whoa, what spell is that?" the cat-eyed girl said. "Oh, it's called Revuelto," Betty replied. "I've got to learn that. Anyways, I'm Zara." The cat-eyed girl placed her hand in front of Betty. Betty was hesitant but shook her hand. The redhead then approached. "I'm Ashton." She shook her hand. "Nice to meet you, Ashton." The last girl approached Betty. She tried giving her a smile. "I'm Maria." They both shook hands. "Nice to meet you, Maria. Nice to meet you all." The four stood awkwardly with each other. "Well then, excited for school?" Zara said. Both Maria and Ashton nodded, while Betty smiled. With nothing more to say, the four roommates all went back to their beds. Betty unpacked her black and gold pillow and blanket and placed them on the bed. She got in her pyjamas, brushed her teeth in the nearby washroom in the hall with the three others and flopped on her bed. "Okay, lights are going off," the high student yelled out in the hall. Their room was in sudden darkness. The only light emitting was the skyline in the distance through the openings of the hedge wall across the window. Betty gazed out in the darkness. She couldn't imagine Thermadore being this grand. It was really a school, not a large mansion like she initially thought. The headmaster seemed friendly, the students as well. Her roommates seemed friendly too. It was unfortunate she couldn't be with her friends, but at least they were close. Home was far. Paddy was far. Everything seemed so far now. It'll be her first time she'd be far from home for at least a year. All Betty hoped now was that the year would be as impressive as the first day.